Okay, so hello everyone. I'm honored to be among you today, and I would like to warmly thank Margaret Ben for invitation, as well as Karl Kügle and Yolanda Plumley for the attention they have given to this work. In this presentation, I would like to address a repertoire that is familiar to medievalists, the Latin motet of the 14th and early 15th centuries. I will focus more specifically on the French tradition, mainly pretextual, that is, works transmitted in major manuscripts such as Fauvel, Ivrea, Chantilly, and Oxford 213. For a long time, while musical analyses are abundant, the same cannot be said of the text. For a long time, these have attracted little interest from both musicologists and philologists. The reasons are well known. A Latin that is often arduous, obscure references, and a disconcerting syntax. As Margaret Bent has recently pointed out, some motets have even been deemed impossible to translate, fostering a degree of mistrust among classicists. It should nevertheless be recalled that these motets constitute an essential body of Latin lyric poetry from this period. This raises one question. Are these texts really incomprehensible, or is it rather our way of approaching them that remains insufficiently equipped? It is precisely this issue that led me to pursue a study of these texts and to seek ways of overcoming their difficulties. I fully share Agathe Sultan's view that the motet is a work that must also be read. Quickly, rhetorical strategies and networks of textual references emerged as essential tools for grasping the meaning of these works. When a motet resists our understanding, it is often because the reference to which it alludes escapes us. It should be noted, by the way, that contemporary vernacular repertoires have been well documented. One eloquent example is Yolanda Plumley's comprehensive work, The Art of Grafting Song. I will therefore begin by presenting a number of observations drawn from traditional philology based on patient and often uncertain research. I will then introduce the initial contributions of more experimental approaches grounded in digital deep learning tools. Their development has required a significant personal investment in terms of time, but they have yielded results that I would not necessarily have anticipated. I will briefly outline how these tools work and, above all, the limitations they had to overcome, as well as their own constraints. The intertextuality of motets comes as no surprise. Since the 13th century, their composition has relied at multiple levels on practices of reuse, the reworking of clausulae, the borrowing of a cantus firmus, the insertion of refrains, and so forth. Textual borrowing is a natural extension of these practices and, in this respect, brings the motet closer to the cantus. Since Emily Dank's dissertation, L'hérésie de Fauvel, we have had at our disposal a solid overview of textual reuse practices in the motets and other songs of the Roman de Fauvel. This work brought to light a wide range of references, biblical passages, especially from the Psalms and the Gospels, excerpts from Ovid and Lucan, as well as reminiscences of later authors such as Walter of Chatillon, John of Salisbury, and many others. This immediately points to a major challenge for intertextual analysis. It amounts to looking for a needle in a haystack, all the more so because our modern view of Latin literature, structured according to historical categories, does not correspond in any way to how the Middle Ages conceptualized this body of knowledge. Studies that have sought to trace textual references in 14th century motets have mainly highlighted two types of writings, biblical books and classical authors. For good reason, biblical discourse is relatively easy to identify both in content and in form. As for the auctores maiores, a handful of well-known explicit mentions have encouraged scholars to identify their presence in a more systematic way. Lucan, Ovid, or even Horace are explicitly named. Such precision remains rare, that would have been too easy. Outside these cases, either a formula is taken up verbatim without any indication of its source, or authorities are mentioned without any real engagement with their works. In these examples, the references function more as allusions than as actual borrowings. The corpus also reveals a clear diachronic evolution. Motets from the early 14th century, such as those found in Fauvel, readily employed direct intertextuality, quotation and or citation, whereas such literal and often proverbial references become increasingly infrequent as the century progresses. In this respect, the explicit reference to Virgil in Nicolas Grenon's motet Ave Virtus remains exceptional. This does not, however, imply the disappearance of classical authors. Poets tend to mobilize shared images and a more diffuse classical culture. Ursula Günther, for example, pointed out that the story of Argus and Io, evoked in Rex Carole, composed in 1370s, refers to the first book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. I would even suggest that the poet draws on a very specific passage, namely the moment when Io, transformed into a cow, is frightened by her own lowing. In this table, the color indicates semantic proximities between extereo, pertereo, mugitus, gemitus, and sonus vox. This example also serves to illustrate the extent to which the adaptation of a passage into a new versification can reshape the borrowing in the manner of a paraphrase. This constitutes another challenge in the search for intertext. The auctores maiores alone are not sufficient to gauge the erudition of these motets. They also contain borrowings from Isidore, Boetius, the writings of the Church Fathers, scientific treatises, and even non-Latin sources. The most striking example that comes to mind is the motet Altisonis Aptatis Viribus, dedicated to Gaston Phoebus, whose text draws on multiple Greek references and even employs transliteration, Euripedis Apreobalia. I rely here on Peter Lefferts' edition for the interpretation of this line. The Greek term balios, used by Euripides to describe dappled horses in Iphigenia Nolis and Rhesus, implies not only a familiarity with Greek vocabulary, but also exceptional access, direct or mediated, to manuscripts such as the Laurentianus 32-2, which circulated in the West via Italy during the 14th century. The same motet contains also noteworthy allusions, including the mention of Dionydas, a pirate confronted by Alexander the Great, whose political exemplum is recounted in detail in John of Salisbury's Polycarticus. This plurality of sources is not always the sign of extensive individual erudition. In many cases, it reflects the medieval way of organizing literature through florilegia. These anthologies freely blend ancient authors, church fathers, moralists, encyclopedists, and even contemporary writers. Anthologies also help to explain how works that were rarely cited in the Middle Ages nevertheless found their way into motets. The use of florilegia has been discussed by Andrew Rothy and Leo Frank Alford Strevens, particularly with regard to the motets preserved in Fauvel and those attributed to Philippe de Vitry. To better grasp the close relationship between motets and florilegia, I propose here a non-exhaustive list of formulas encountered in the corpus. I draw in part on the work of Andrew Rothy and Leofran Alford Strevens, but also occurrences that I have identified myself. The contents of collections such as the Manipulus Florum, the Polythecon, the Florilegium Gallicum, or the Liber Pharetre resonate with the motets, especially those from the early 14th century. I have nevertheless chosen to add the singular case of De Gentis Vita at the end of the list in the latter Chanty Codex, which appears to continue this same tradition through its non-liturgical tenor entitled Vera Pudicitia, which is actually from Augustine. Beyond the mere coincidence of formulas with these anthologies, it is sometimes possible to identify shared syntactic patterns which more clearly attest to the use of florilegia. This is precisely what encouraged Andrew to draw closer connections between Philippe de Vitry and florilegia such as the Polythecon. The same observation can be made elsewhere, for example, through this quotation from Boetius found in Nulla Pestis. This does not, however, imply an ignorance of complete works. Philippe de Vitry was clearly well acquainted with Ovid's Epistula Expontor. In a different literary register, the numerous borrowings from Cyprien's De Zelo et Livore in Facilius et Nobis Vitatur likewise attest to recourse to the complete source, whether in written form or preserved in memory. Florilegia above all revealed the composer's proximity to the stance of the medieval rhetorician, inherited from the artist's poetry. The primacy of the materia, as asserted in the De Modo Compenendi Tenores Motetorum, naturally guided the selection of quotations from thematically organized anthologies. Now, from a research perspective, florilegia offers a valuable aid by narrowing an otherwise dizzying range of potential sources. An effective method consists in identifying segments likely to have been quoted and confronting them with the major collections. especially since dedicated databases do exist, such as the Digital Viridarium Consolationis project hosted by Wilfrid Laurier University. This assistance remains partial, however, and can prove illusory. On one hand, certain passages borrowed are not necessarily found in anthologies. On the other hand, as noted earlier, the further one moves into the 14th century, the more intertextuality becomes diffuse and non-proverbial, rendering the identification of references uncertain. In short, the explicit use of Florilegia appears to dissolve over time, or at least the relationship between composers, poets, and anthologies seems to change. Moreover, anthologies shed little light on the many intertextual phenomena that operate within the corpus itself. It is common for motet composers to influence one another, to quote one another, or even to engage in self-quotation. This aspect has already attracted scholarly attention. The corpus can be structured into thematic subgraphs linked by shared material, images, or expressions. Studying such a network amounts to examining the repertoire according to its own discursive logics. Some connections are broad in scope, such as the group of musician motets recently studied by Margaret Bent, characterized by musical and astronomical metaphors. Through their interest in the stars, these motets connect to a wider constellation that include Pythagoras Pedometa or Phoebus Mundo Oriens, the latter itself belonging to the subgroup of motets dedicated to Gaston Phoebus. These groupings, necessarily porous, can quickly become complex. Other connections, however, are far more subtle, such as the formula Tempe Celestia, identified by Karl Kügle in a motet from the Cypriot Codex and shared by Abtacaro and Altisonis. What should we make of such shared formulas? One thing is clear, these recurrences attest to the existence of internal networks of reminiscences that remain largely unmapped. These observations led me to rethink my methodology. Ideally, I would need a tool capable of comparing all motets both with one another and with large literary corpora, moving beyond literal correspondences to grasp semantic context above all, especially in cases of paraphrases or allusions. One might imagine a tool that is mutatis mutandis, similar to ChatGPT. While the latter is poorly suited to Latin and is by no means a scholarly tool, its underlying principle remains fruitful for natural language processing. Building on my work in deep learning applied to medieval manuscripts, I therefore turned to large language models, and more specifically to Latin BERT. Created in 2020 by David Baman and Patrick Burns, Latin BERT was trained on a substantial portion of Latin text available online, especially the Latin Library, the Internet Archive, Google Books, and so on. This model offers a sufficiently fine-grained level of understanding to compare semantic context, distinguish grammatical functions, and even complete lacunary passages. Let me dispel any illusions. Latin BERT is by no means user-friendly. The result I am about to present relies on in-house Python developments. They are embedded within a project of enriched digital editions of motets encompassing both text and music, in which every word, name, citation, or allusion will be identified and encoded in TEI XML and MEI XML. This format will ultimately make it possible to cross-reference the content of all pretextual motets composed in the West. In this way, the corpus can be queried directly, for example, to determine which author is cited most frequently or which themes are most widely shared. To put it briefly, my approach to intertextual research is based on a normalized edition of motet text with the regularization of spellings toward classical Latin whenever possible, as Latin BERT performs better under these conditions. From an editorial perspective, I of course retain a medieval version of the text. The motets are then compared with a reference corpus and vectorized using Latin BERT. Each word is assigned a large numerical signature, a number composed of 4,608 values, encoding semantic, syntactic, and contextual parameters. The more dimensions these vectors include, the more finally the numerical signature is able to encode the meaning of a word within its context. The comparison relies on the contextual nearest neighbors analysis. The target word is randomly selected, its immediate environment is extracted, such as the surrounding lines or words, and numerically similar sequences are then sought in other vectorized text. The analysis is not literal, but semantic. Thus, a sentence such as "I very much enjoy medieval music" would be considered close to I am interested in early polyphony, despite the absence of shared words, which makes this tool particularly useful for detecting paraphrases or allusions. Naturally, literal quotations also yield very high similarity scores. To date, I have applied this type of method to a corpus of 136 motet texts of French provenance. I began by carrying out an automatic comparison between each text to focus on internal intertext. At first, I was skeptical about the value of the result, especially given that it was necessary to develop an ecosystem of Python scripts to make Latin BERT operational. I was nevertheless quickly reassured by a number of control values. What you see here is a map of average semantic similarity between the texts. The purpose is simple. Based on the average scores given by Latin BERT for each text, in terms of overall similarity of meaning, a classification algorithm projects the result into a semantic space with various clusters. While this visualization is pretty unclear, it actually reflects existing scholarly consensuses quite faithfully. The contextual projection of the text reveals coherent thematic groupings, notably a very homogeneous cluster of motets with musical and astronomical themes in pink, closely related to the musician motets. This group is clearly distinguished, for example, from motets with strictly religious themes in green. It also allows for the emergence of sometimes unexpected connections, such as that between Multipliciter Amando, preserved in Chantilly, and a group of Fauvel motets clearly denouncing various vices. I have not yet explored this relationship in depth, but given that Multipliciter Amando is difficult to characterize within the Latin corpus, since it is a matter of deducting virtuous love, it may well open up a promising line of inquiry. And it is precisely this kind of surprise that makes the approach so productive, especially since the model also operates at a fine-grained level. Latin BERT readily identifies specific textual reuses, such as the biblical quotation shared by Super Cathedram and Iurequod, stemming from the Gospel of Matthew. It has also revealed clear reuses, for instance, between two religious passages from two distinct motets by Johannes Carmen, here Salve Pater and Salve Sancta Aeterna. Latin BERT has likewise been able to uncover much more subtle affinities, such as the following one between the motets Apta Caro and Altisonis. These similarities are based both on shared syntax, vocis vocibus and plus solito, and on a common semantic context centered on instrumental performance, nablum tange et psalere, that is playing the harp and playing the cithara. I must admit that I was particularly delighted by this connection, especially between two such complex motets. Apta Caro and Altisonis are indeed both renowned for their difficulty, their Greek imagery, and date from the mid-14th century. Moreover, it should be recalled that Apta Caro and Altisonis share other intertexts, such as Tempe Celestia mentioned previously. Such proximity further tends to bring their compositional context closer together. This is something I will need to explore further in the future. Let us now turn to the comparison of the 136 texts with a corpus of 50 works by classical authors drawn from the Latin library. In the same way, firstly, Latin BERT readily identifies what we already know, namely the most explicit quotations, such as those from Cato or Lucan, encountered in Aman Novi or Scariotis Geniture. Even in cases of paraphrase, Latin BERT is able to detect affinities. For example, the adaptation of the opening lines of Horace Ars Poetica at the beginning of In Virtute Nominum is clearly recognized. The system does not stop there, however, and proposed additional possible connections, such as here with a passage from the Metamorphoses, the second one here. I will return later to what it means in terms of methodology to obtain such a large number of potential results. I was continuing to examine these well-known borrowings when, among the highest-ranking results, the following case emerged. What did Latin BERT detect in Imbribus Iriguis? First, a shared literal formula, socia factatuis. Second, a shared formal feature. Both passages are written in hexameters and pentameters. It is an elegiac couplet. But if the similarity score is so high, this is not for these reasons alone. The organization of the word and their semantic structure betray a pastiche, a contrafacture of Ovid's passage. It is no longer a matter of a bird of prey and its talons, but of a cow, in keeping with the preceding context, here addressed as genitrix, and of its horns. The vocative occupies the same position, accipiter genitrix, as does the ablative unguibus and cornibus. Note also the parallelism between the two verbs teretur and cavet. In both scenarios, something frightened is wounded by an animal through the use of a sharp bodily part. Encountering an adaptation such as this in the motet Interdensas allows us to observe several points. As noted earlier, classical authors did not disappear from the latter 14th century motets, but rather appear under different conditions. Imitation is one of his modes, and it is entirely consistent with the tone of this motet, whose motetus is written in hexameters. One may also note formulas that directly address the reader, such as mirares or oquam spectandus, which recall interpolations like mirabile dictu or visa nefas found, for example, in the Aeneid. Other analyses have revealed affinities with further passages from classical works. While the incipit Interdensas recall Virgil eclogues, the fragrant garden of Ovid's Fasti resonates with the vegetal imagery of the motetus. This does not, however, mean that one should necessarily posit a direct quotation on the basis of such literal correspondences alone. These parallels nevertheless suggest possible inspirations and point to a form of diffuse intertextuality that is difficult to apprehend without recourse to such computational tools. This aspect raises a major question. How far can we be certain that we have identified a reference and its source? A tool such as Latin BERT can reinforce our hypothesis, while also troubling our certainties. Thus, for the incipit of the motet Cola Hugo, I was surprised to see that, instead of privileging Ovid's Remedia Amoris as proposed by Andrew Wathy, the model foregrounds Horace's satire, followed by Ovid's Tristia. The point is not to categorically overturn the primacy of the Remedia Amoris, but rather to question the very limits of intertextual identification. For if Latin BERT is able to nuance the origin of the opening line of Cola Hugo, it is precisely because the model has the capacity to do so. When searching within a large corpus, one must indeed observe that the syntagm Cola Hugo is far from rare. It appears, for example, also in Ovid's Pontics. One might, however, temper the significance of such correspondences by recalling that the formulation found in the Remedia Amoris is attested in florilegia such as the Polythecon. But the line from the Exponto also appears in florilegia, for instance, in the Florilegium Gallicum. What is more, in this same florilegium, is it possible to find a formula even closer to the one used by Vitry, aptaque servili subdere cola Hugo, attributed to Prosper of Aquitaine. When I became aware of its proximity without the assistance of computational tools, I briefly hoped that I had identified a more clearly circumscribed source. Yet, the expression subdere cola Hugo itself is also attested elsewhere. It is found notably in Prudentius, whose popularity in the Middle Ages can hardly be denied. While computers are capable of detecting fine-grained semantic proximities, they cannot guarantee their hermeneutic relevance. Interdiscursive practices are widespread in Latin literature and constitute a potential bias in the results. Even when certain formulas are attested in florilegia, just like summum bonum or sic ad astra, the frequency with which they are reused and the fluidity of the attributions invite us to relativize the hypothesis of a deliberate invocation. There are other examples of quotations and textual correspondences that I would have liked to discuss with you, but doing so would have required far more time. At the conclusion of this first experimental phase, it is clear that the use of Latin BERT uncovers far more connections than I had initially hoped for, while also recovering potential correspondences with Lucan's Bellum Civile or the ditches of Cato. Moreover, these results remain preliminary. The analysis has not yet been extended to major reference corpora, just like the patristic or biblical ones, nor to structured florilegia, and the encoding of the motet corpus is still incomplete. Expanding the corpus will undoubtedly yield further results. It is essential to emphasize one key point. There is no form of magic at work here. The correspondences proposed by the model do not constitute proof in themselves and call for critical examination. Therefore, the computer does not replace the researcher. It indicates where to look by signaling interesting elements whose relevance must always be assessed. But the power of this method allows us to approach intertextuality through the notion of literary space, thus addressing the thorny issue of influence while moving beyond the somewhat reductive direct quotation. It is also not accidental that the motets yielding the most compelling results so far are precisely those whose complexity has long been recognized. Interdensas, Altisonis, or Aptacaro stand out for the density of their discursive layers. This observation tends to confirm that their difficulty lies less in their vocabulary than in an interviewing of diffuse references. By identifying these networks, one may hope to restore the semantic richness of these works and better understand the compositional relationships they share. It is with this aim in mind that I intend, in the near future, to couple this work with a comparative analysis of musical discourse, in the case of internal intertext especially. Finally, it also seems important to me to emphasize that the issues raised by digital methodologies extend far beyond the sole field of musicology and, a fortiori, that of motets. This type of approach can provide valuable insight into a wide range of Latin and vernacular corpora, in which intertextuality and reuse play a central role. These methods open up new perspectives for the study of literary cultures as a whole. In the midst of the current AI boom, it seems that we are entering a new stage of digital philology and musicology, one in which the late medieval motet still has much to tell us and, by virtue of its features, much to teach us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Kévin, thank you so much. You've opened up such exciting new vistas which I hope will inject new life into the study of late medieval music. You've brought very powerful new methodologies to bear on a repertoire which many of us present are interested in, and some of those you've named in your paper. The possibilities of more systematic study of these texts and the potential for identifying imprecisely or variably cited allusions in the text is very exciting indeed. Let's turn first to our invited discussants. As I announced at the beginning, Yolanda Plumley is unfortunately unable to be here today due to a family emergency, but she formulated some questions which Joe Mason has agreed to read out, and Kévin will respond to those. Thank you. So, Joe impersonating Yolanda.
I'll do my best. So Yolanda's first question for Kévin is as follows. You demonstrate how shared formulas directly link certain motets, and you suggest that subtler relationships between works are yet to be teased out. Have you encountered any instances where relationships between works suggest an origin in a common environment or a direct connection between two or more poet-composers?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an interesting question, and it is exactly what I finally want to discover, although it is really difficult to trace. So in some cases, it seems relatively clear. I'm especially thinking about the two Fauvel motets, Eurequod and Super Cathedram, that share the same biblical quotation stemming from the Gospel of Matthew. Here, the context of Fauvel itself points to a shared environment of production. But I'm also thinking about something less well known concerning the three motets dedicated to Gaston III, Interdensas, Altisonis, and Phoebus Muto Oriens, because as far as I know, there is not any shared quotations between them, but they do share a few specific topics and images, and I mean beyond Gaston Phoebus himself, and of course the figure of the sun, which is really popular in order to characterize him. There is actually also a fairly strong interest in vegetation, in landscape, in fruit, which seems to be an analogy for opulence here. So things that fall outside what we usually find in all the motets of French provenance, but things that truly define the beautiful landscape of the Béarn, the good context of the court of Béarn during the 14th century, and that we also can find in some vernacular poetry dedicated to Gaston Phébus. So the court of Béarn obviously seems to be the relevant context here. And if I can add another thing, sometimes the difficulty may also derive from the way we tend to approach motets. I'm thinking in particular about the relationship between Aptacaro and Altisonis, because Aptacaro has often been linked to Philippe de Vitry, while Altisonis belongs to the group of motets dedicated to Gaston Phébus. So, on this basis, in the musicological literature, they have been treated separately. But these two motets strike me as really close, really close from a textual point of view. So, what can we actually conclude from this? Does one composer drawn on the other? Are the two motets by the same person? And if so, it's certainly not Vitry. Or should we perhaps distinguish between the roles of composer and poet? And in this case, which would make the whole equation even more complex. So it's really hard to say, but in any case, I really hope that this kind of intertextual research will allow us to nuance or even precise some ideas we have in literature concerning the attribution, the stylistic evidences, something about which we cannot make absolutely sure, actually.
Thank you. Yolanda's next question.
Is there scope to widen your approach across divides of musical genre and language? For instance, to consider Latin motets alongside French motets, French lyrics or songs, and other types of Latin religious lyrics?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this as a kind of natural next step for my project. And by the way, I discussed 1 year ago with Mark Everest about the relationship between the motet and the conductus, and we thought it would be really interesting to compare the both repertoires, especially on the basis of the use of classical authors, because Mark is also working on this subject in the framework of the conductus. But yeah, totally. Concerning the vernacular repertoires, it would be really interesting to add them, whether vernacular motets or songs. And by the way, at some point it will be a necessity for me because it's difficult to study bilingual motets while excluding one of the languages. Actually, if I'm limiting myself for now to Latin and to motets, it's mainly for reasons of methodological coherence. But of course, poetic imagery clearly transcends languages and repertoires. And by the way, one of the beautiful source we have for the 14th century, I mean, beautiful literary source we have is the Ovid Moralisé at the beginnings of the 14th century. So it's a quite a beautiful source and a good example of the symbiosis between the two worlds. So it's definitely something I try to keep in mind. But something interesting also about this subject, it also represents a kind of challenge from an IT point of view, because if it's possible to work with Latin, with medieval Latin, thanks to a tool like Latin Bert, it is far from perfect, but we can improve it. As far as I know, concerning old vernaculars, it remains highly experimental. So, but it also opens exciting prospect for developing the tools we currently lack, tools that can be able to understand various early languages at the same time in order to better trace the intertextual phenomena across different traditions. So it will be really interesting. So definitely it will be a next step at some point. Yeah.
And Yolanda's third question, Joe?
This is a question about manuscripts. Could studying the manuscripts and transmission patterns of this repertory of motets further help connect works with shared elements, for example, by pointing to a shared environment or a shared musical culture or shared readership? And Yolanda adds, maybe you could tell us a bit about your manuscripts project. What might this add?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a good question. And so in some cases, we can actually see that intertextual analysis or even semantic analysis closely follows the internal coherence of certain sources. And I'm especially thinking in particular of Fauvel, which is fairly natural in itself because Fauvel functions as a kind of conceptual source with ideas that circulate across the different pieces. But something interesting is that the analysis I have carried out so far on more than 100 motet texts shows that most of the text inside Fauvel form an extremely coherent and robust corpus. There is no equivalent actually in the corpus. Even the three motets specifically dedicated to Gaston Phoebus are not so close, and even the Latin motets composed by Machaut are not so close. So this is why one of the things I would like to do once the entire corpus will be edited in TI and MEI is to overlay this result with geographical and cultural data drawn from the manuscript themselves. And this is precisely why I keep this information inside the TI and MEI files. The aim would be to see whether intertextual clusters, for example, align with spatial patterns across Europe. And if I can add some word about my project in Tours, so this is the DINOTEM project developed within the research infrastructure Biblissima Plus. It's a project I lead with my colleague David Fiala. And the objective of the project is to train image recognition models specifically designed to detect musical components in medieval manuscript. And so concretely, I'm currently finalizing the first web application of the project. And so it will allow users to upload manuscript images and retrieve structured information. For example, if we upload an image of 14th century polyphony, the system, which is the computer, will be able to identify it as a polyphony and not monody, to detect the different voices, to explain why this is the upper voices and the lower voice, how many voices there are, if some voices are missing, to identify the language, to say some things about the content of the text, because it's possible to retrieve some keywords. So this kind of things. And to be totally honest, for the moment, it doesn't help me much in my work on intertextuality, but maybe in the near future it would be possible to better trace similarities between some sources online thanks to this kind of tool. And in this case, it would be really helpful concerning the intertextual research. Yeah.
Thank you. And Yolanda's final question, Joe?
Yes, can you tell us a bit more about the digital tools that you're using here and in your manuscript project, and how you think developments in such digital tools are going to help deepen our understanding of the late medieval musical repertory in the coming years?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So concerning the tools I'm using, so I use deep learning systems, and always it's something that is really important for me. I always use open access and open source systems. It's really important to ensure the scientific transparency, but also the scientific freedom. And so the goal is different between the both projects, but the computational working remains globally the same. So for my intertextual research, I use Python to develop the various scripts, especially the scripts I need to program Latin BERT and other Python libraries specialized in lexicometry like CLTK. It's not really famous, but it's really fun and really interesting in order to automatically find the lemma of a Latin word or to define its grammatical role, what we call sometimes the POS tag, the part of speech tag. And for my other project, Dinotem, I use for the image recognition, I use the YOLO algorithm. Here, YOLO means in reality, you only look once, because it's a really efficient system that doesn't need much time to recognize information in an image. And so I also use sometimes a very practical tool for automatically reading and transcribing text in medieval manuscripts, namely the Kraken system, which is completely open access and open source and really efficient. And so concerning maybe the contribution of these tools, I think one of the really key contribution is scale, simply scale, because I found that that what is truly remarkable is not imitating humans, but imitating them on corpora that are completely inaccessible to them in terms of quantity. And it is clear that musicology and even medieval musicology will increasingly tend toward large-scale approaches. And in fact, we have had to create databases for this purpose, and which will now feed these tools and on which we will be able to train them. So definitely, I'm really interested in this concept of scale. This is a change for me.
Thank you. Thank you. These tools are tremendously exciting and important. And I think the number of those of us present who've worked on these motets, I think only a very small number, if any, will have the mastery of these new tools. And so I think what you're doing here is putting forward a very exciting new development for animating the study of these repertoires. Right. Our second respondent is Karl Kügle, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Utrecht, with many visiting appointments and honours to his credit and publications on many aspects of late medieval music. Recent work was centred on two ERC grants, Malmec on the role of music in courtly life of the long 14th century, was held at Oxford 2016 to 22, and the other project, Val Sounds, was carried out at Leuven 2023 to 25, jointly with a multidisciplinary team from architectural history and acoustics and performer collaborators from the Schola Cantorum in Basel. Both projects have yielded significant publications, some already available and some forthcoming. Karl, your questions for Kévin, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Meg, and thank you, Kévin, first of all, for this lovely presentation, which, as I agree with Meg here, really opens up some very interesting prospects for our future understanding of this genre and its texts. So, my first question goes into a little bit of a different direction of the ones that we've discussed so far. I'm interested in your views in general and also specifically as far as the Latin motet repertory is concerned about the interaction between the texts and the music. Do you see one or the other as primary, or do you see them as complementary, or is the question maybe not properly the one that I should ask you? So I invite you to discuss a little bit how you see these two elements, which are clearly coherent in this genre, perhaps more than in others. And give us a bit of your view how this plays into the evolution of your project as you see it at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a really interesting question. Actually, so concerning this relationship between the text and the music, the more I work on the text, the more convinced I am that they play a primary role in the composition of motets. If we look at the importance of the material, its importance in concerning the choice of the tenor voice, the cantus firmus, the poetic matter, the very subtle relationships that can exist between different texts within a same motet, or even the way poetic rhythm sometimes seems to be called or at least respected by musical rhythm. It becomes quite clear, according to me, that composition often starts from the texts themselves, which, by the way, I really think are already fully formed. And yeah, more generally, there is a striking degree of care given to the text. And so this is why sometimes I think that they function almost as autonomous literary works and can hardly be treated as secondary. And something also that encourages me to think in this way. And we know that there were collaborations between composers and poets for certain motets. So this also encourages to think in this case that it was more often the composer who focused on one a poet had written rather than the other way. That seems much more logical to me. Otherwise, it would imply that the poet was extremely constrained by musical features, musical considerations, and this would go against what we know of medieval compositional practice in general, except maybe for contrafacture, but it's something specific, I guess. So I tend to see the text above all as a kind of foundation for the composers. Yeah, it's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, there may be more discussion about this later on. So as I see Meg nodding, so in the interest of time, I will not now respond with your approval, Meg, and go on to my second question, just to open up more material for the discussion later. Now, several times in your presentation, you mentioned the French tradition and motets of French provenance. But your three of your main four witnesses you invoked, namely Ivrea, Chantilly, and Oxford, are not from France. So I would like to hear more about your views to what extent this repertory is transnational, for lack of a better word, to what extent, and that is a bit already what Yolanda wanted to know, you mentioned several clusters. One is the Phébus group, and the other one is the Fauvel cluster of pieces, obviously. But beyond that, can you at this point see any further connections? You also mentioned Tempe Celestia, which indeed I would agree is an interesting little chunk, perhaps, of uh, that certainly is seductive in thinking about what it might mean. But basically, there's of course a long chronology, and it seems to be a move, coincidental or not, in terms of what you're interested in, away from the north of France, more to the south of Europe, in terms of the transmission of these pieces. Um, yeah. How do you see the chronology and the geography playing into your project? Is that perhaps irrelevant, or do you think there is a need to take that into account as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question, and at first I completely agree with you talking about motets of French provenance when we are dealing with sources that were produced elsewhere, maybe in a multicultural context, is indeed problematic. So when I refer to provenance, I rely more on compositional features and on some scholarly consensuses we share for many motets, but not for all of them, by the way. For example, Graciosus Fervidus, Argevices Polyphemus, are they Italian, are they French? Actually, I don't know. And this is precisely where questions of regional parameters become particularly interesting. And since, as you say, the main sources are not French, it is precisely an indication of the transnational circulation of the repertoire. So to be completely honest, since I have so far focused mainly on motets usually described as being of French provenance, I have not identified clear regional or transregional features, apart from the well-known case we are familiar with. But what can I say is, since my aim ultimately is to encode the entire corpus of motets produced in Western Europe, between the early 14th century and the middle of the 15th century, I would like to revisit these geographical distinctions using a purely computational approach. In fact, I was influenced by what I saw in anthropology and mythology studies because some colleagues have recently been working on the auto-classification of myths, of stories and shared narratives across cultures, sometimes over very long time spans. And they use what we call for this in computer science decision trees, and to reconstruct genetic groupings between different versions of a same tale, of a same story in this case. And so at a more advanced stage of my project, I would like to confront similar results for motets with the categories we currently use. Maybe it will help bring to light groupings, probably transnational ones, but are difficult for us to explain precisely because of our large national or regional frameworks. And in this way, it becomes possible, I hope, to trace how compositional processes, strategies evolve or migrate over time and across space. Yeah, this is what I can say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe if I just make a quick suggestion before I move on to the next question. It seems to me that perhaps when you speak of French motets or motets of French provenance, what you really mean, and I think we can all agree on that slight revision of terminology, is the polytextual motet. That would be my one point. You can respond later to that, so we can move on. And I also would like to remind you that there's a huge repertory which doesn't seem to figure, at least in what you said so far, in the Turin J29 Codex, which of course has also very strong French influence.
Mm.
So if it isn't already in the sample, I suggest you take that into account.
Paul,
Yeah.
Karl, to clarify, by polytextual, do you mean different languages, French and Italian? Because
No, two different texts, two different
but
texts.
aren't all the motets that Kévin is dealing with polytext?
Yeah, that's what I said. So I think I mean, what people usually see as the essential feature of other varieties.
Oh, mm.
So I think we're in agreement, actually. Maybe I wasn't
Okay, all right.
expressing myself clearly. So anyways, the suggestion would be to maybe, instead of saying French motets, calling them polytextual motets with two different texts. That's what I meant.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that would then it would have the advantage that it gets you out of these PMFC classifications, which I think most people will agree are a bit outdated, let's say, although they were necessary at the time. Now, my next question is related to the very, very large and often underappreciated corpus of Latin creativity, poetic creativity in the long 14th century, where we are moving here. My main exemplar to underline this is always the fact that Petrarch wrote a very long unfinished opus called Africa, and he hoped that he would be remembered by this Africa, and he wrote a fantastic array of Latin poetry. I like it very much. So this is very much off the radar. So while Yolanda already asked to what extent you can draw connections to other repertories, I want to reiterate that question and sharpen it a little bit and ask you whether you see any possibilities to bring the whole, medieval Latinity and even Neo-Latinity, because this creativity really continues into the 15th century and even the 16th century. Sometimes we call it humanism, which certainly is overlapping. So, how do you see your project in relationship to that vast and very interesting corpus, which of course also includes genres like the epic, which are probably less relevant, but you quoted several huge classical epics, so maybe it's not quite entirely irrelevant.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. It's really interesting. So to say some words about this, I prefer to see Latin motet poetry as part, exactly as you said, of a broad and active field of Latin writing, rather than as something confined to a single music genre to the 14th century. And that said, approaching 14th century Latin literature remains, for me, difficult, since vernacular tradition seems to have generally displaced Latin production. But this is also, you're totally right, this is also unfortunately an idea that continues to shape historiography. Because if we look at the work of our colleagues in philology or Latin studies, the 14th century is underrepresented. The rise of the classical tradition in education is usually located in the 12th century and perhaps extended to the 13th. But after that, everything seems to suggest that Latin literature and theory decline, except perhaps in England, but I'm not an expert on this subject. But we do know that there was indeed a crisis in the teaching of Latin at this time. Yet the Latin motet of the early 14th century offers a powerful example of this continuation, this survival of this Latin art. So I really think that musicology, by the way, has a great deal to contribute to the study of 14th century and early 15th century Latin poetry, since actually some of the most striking and ambitious Latin repertoires of the period are in fact musical. And in terms of similar corpus during the 14th century, yeah, actually, I was thinking about trying to compare with Latin poetry with a kind of politically oriented Latin poetry, and I was thinking about also the Epistolae Metricae of Petrarch. Yes, but yeah, you're totally right. I can also look at Africa, of course. Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Karl. Karl, would you like to keep your final question to the general discussion?
we can do that. That's fine. Yes, certainly.
If I could just take my prerogative of being the convener of this seminar to pick up one point that Kévin made in response to Karl, namely that I think you said that the texts were you made the case that the texts were primary, and you made some separation between the poet and the composer. In the cases that we know about, Vitry and Machaut, everybody assumes that the composer and the poet are the same. And there, of course, there's some signed motets where the composer signs the text. It's one of the premises of my motet book that text and music were conceived together. And in some cases, I think I was able to demonstrate this. Do you stick to your insistence that the poet is primary?
I think it's maybe not it's not always like that, but yeah, I really think actually maybe because during my PhD and my PhD thesis I devoted a whole chapter to this question, and I tried to show that even the tenor part seems to anticipate formal features of the text, but sometimes maybe it's not a general rule, and that really only makes sense if the texts are written before the music and even before the tenor part. So um, yeah, it's a complex question actually, but yeah, I should also say that Anasa Rusnaya's work about the role of the upper voices has been very influential for me here, and I found it extremely inspiring. So, yeah, the primacy of the text seems rather logical to me, but you're totally right. Maybe for personality like Machaut or Vitry, it's different, but yeah, I don't know. I prefer to see Maestro, but maybe it's also the problem. But I prefer to see Maestro as a poet, maybe before a musician. I don't know why, but maybe it's I don't know. It's
Well,
yeah,
or perhaps Andrew Wathy will have something to say about that in
yeah,
terms of the
maybe.
fact that it's Vitry motet texts which seem to dominate the separate presentation of motet texts. The kinds of quotation and allusion that I've studied in this repertoire involve text and music, and I found in many between the motets, obviously haven't dealt with the classical allusions and citations in the depth that your new tools have enabled you to do. But sometimes these quotations involve text and melody, or text and rhythm, or rhythm and melody. The three elements of words, rhythm and melody, are assorted and used in different kinds of allusion, which again suggests a rather close connection between the text and the music when allusions and quotations are involved.
Yeah, yeah. To be honest, I have not focused so far about the music part, but yeah, I really guess that it's totally possible to find some points where what we can see in the text is also happened also in the music. So it would be great at some point to compare when the corpus will be entirely encoded in TI, but also in AMI with the music to compare music similarities and to superimpose them with textual borrowings. Yeah, it's sure we will see great things. Yes, through that. Yeah.
Karl, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I just wanted to add to this a little bit that I agree with you, Meg, that sometimes already in chant practice, sometimes the melody is stable and the texts change, and sometimes the texts are stable and the melody changes. So there is no clean-cut medium which takes precedence. And sorry, Kévin, to make your life even more complicated, there's of course the practice of contrafacture, which in a way both melodic and textual. So I see them personally more as complementary. Deschamps has a beautiful metaphor. He talks about vernacular poetry, but it may mutatis mutandis, I think, be also applied to Latin creativity or Latin textic creativity. He thinks that they are like husband and wife, text and music. So they're not the same. They can exist on their own, but together they're at their best. So you get the best sort of presentation. I think it's quite a beautiful and suitable metaphor to, in a way, grasp what is conceptually really, really very different, I think, in the medieval mind of the period we're studying to how a modern composer or a modern person approaches these phenomena.